You're listening to
and such a short amount of time to do it in.
a Mamamia podcast.
Do you know how long it took me to write the intro that I'm reading right now? A day. And that's not because it's going to take you a day to listen to. That would be terrifying. It's actually less than 2 minutes, but still it took me a whole day. And that's because in between writing it, I did at least a dozen other things. I sent texts and emails. I went to a meeting. I opened a package that arrived. I made myself a cup of tea. I called my mum. I posted something on Instagram, and then I checked my emails, and then I went back to see how many comments I had on Instagram. Then I had another meeting. And between all of those things, I kept coming back to this document to try and remember what the hell I wanted to write. Does your brain feel like a marshmallow lately? Mine does. Do you find it hard to concentrate? I do. Do you pick up your phone to check, the weather, and then find that an hour has passed and you're somehow on the Facebook page of your high school English teacher or your ex-partner's new girlfriend, and you've forgotten why on earth you picked up your phone in the first place? Oh man, it has been so hard to focus lately. Is it COVID? Is it technology? Is it ADHD? Is it Perry? And is it my fault? If you ask my guest today, Johann Hari, he'll tell you no, it's not my fault. And it's not your fault either. Because apparently we haven't lost our focus. It's not like something we misplaced accidentally. Our focus has been stolen from us deliberately by some of the smartest and richest brains in the world.
I felt like with each year that passed, things that require deep focus, that are so deep to my sense of self, were getting more and more like running up a down escalator. Do you know what I mean? I could still do them.
I do.
But they were getting harder and harder. And I noticed this seemed to be happening to everyone around me. I was particularly worried about the young people I knew who seemed to be so often whirring at the speed of Snapchat where nothing still or serious could touch them. Every now and then I'd dip in, I'd see these really shocking facts. For every one child who was identified with attention problems when I was 7 years old, there's now 100 children who've been identified with serious attention problems. And the average American office worker now focuses on any one task for only 3 minutes. But I kept telling myself, but doesn't every generation think this?
From Mamamia, I'm Mia Friedman, and you're listening to No Filter, a podcast where people tell their stories very candidly and aren't afraid to be vulnerable. Johann Hari is a journalist and an author and the godfather of a bunch of kids, one of whom, a teenage boy, was going a bit off the rails. And it was some of the things that Johann saw and observed in his godson and in himself and in everyone around him that made him realise we are all struggling to concentrate. So he wrote this incredible book about it. And if you panicked at the thought of having to concentrate long enough to read a whole book, I can relate to that, which is why I invited Johann onto No Filter, to explain and to help. And I'll be honest with you, when I heard about this book, it was recommended to me by Jessie Stevens, who hosts True Crime Conversations, and she's my co-host on Mamamia Out Loud. I felt a bit scared or defeated or something because, I assumed that, yes, it's the fault of technology that we can't concentrate and there's not really anything I can do about it unless I move to a yurt in Mongolia with no internet, which I really don't want to do. But then, when I did speak to Johann, I learned about the things we can do to improve our focus right now, today. And I also learned that it's not actually just about technology. There is so much in this conversation that's going to make you go, oh my God, that's me. And I can't wait for you to hear it. I want to ask you about the week before you went to Provincetown. You decided to do a digital detox and you decided to go to Provincetown. Can you explain for those of us who don't really have a reference for Provincetown what it is and why that was the place you chose?
I was so tired of being wired. I was so tired of feeling my attention get worse. I was so tired of the exhausting roller coaster of the internet that I was in this really lucky position. The film rights to one of my books had just sold. So I just announced to everyone, you know what? I'm just done with this. I'm going away for 3 months. I'm going to have no smartphone. I'm going to have no laptop that can get onto the internet. I'm just done. I'd had a particularly terrible experience with a young person in my life that also had just horrified me about what's happening to our attention. So it was completely by chance I chose Provincetown. I had been there for one day a year before. So Provincetown is a little resort town in Cape Cod. It's the tip of the United States. In fact, the unofficial slogan for Provincetown is Provincetown, just the tip, which I love. Picture Byron Bay with a lot less surfing and a lot more gay sex acts that I probably can't mention on your podcast.
Okay, so is it a bit like Fire Island? I've heard about Fire Island.
No, it's more fancy than Fire Island. But what gives you a sense of it is more than one person in Provincetown makes a full-time living by dressing as Ursula, the villain in The Little Mermaid, and singing songs about cunnilingus. So that gives you some sense of what it's like, right?
Fabulous.
Exactly. It's got a lot going for it. And when I arrived there, I left my phone and my laptop with my friend in Boston, and I took a boat across the water to Provincetown. And I kept patting my pocket really anxious, like, shit, I've left my phone somewhere. And then realising, oh no, you've deliberately left your phone somewhere.
Tell me about your first day. Like, did you set rules up for these 3 months that you had?
So I left the phone and the internet in Boston with my friend Shailene. I'd rented a little sliver of a beach house and I'd got them to remove the modem in case in some act of madness I went and bought an internet-connected device.
Oh, yeah.
And I had a few friends in Provincetown and I said to them, don't ever give me your phone. Even if I beg you, don't do it. So I tried to really lock myself in. And I knew this, of course, wasn't a sustainable solution. To be honest, I was just desperate.
Yeah.
And that first day, I remember just feeling this sort of, I know it sounds odd to describe something as immaterial as the internet as heavy, but I felt like I had laid down a heavy load. And I felt almost drunk with lightness and this sort of weird haze of decompression. And there's a cupcake shop in Provincetown and I went and I ate 7 cupcakes. That was my withdrawal.
Yes.
And they were big American cupcakes, not the little pissy little ones you get in Byron Bay, right?
The size of
Exactly. The size of a boot, right? So yeah, that's my memory of the first day.
And by the end of that time, or as the weeks went on, what did you notice?
There was that first 2 weeks when I was in that mode of decompression and I was relieved, but I wasn't quite in the mode of being able to focus, or I was sort of still reading in the way that I did online. I remember reading David Copperfield, the Charles Dickens novel, and going, okay, come on, Dickens, I've got it. He's an orphan. Come on now. What's the next thing, right? And sort of being in this sort of still in quite a manic, extractive mode, even though I felt relieved. And then I felt a great sense of calm. And then I remember this terrible crash. I was walking down the beach and Provincetown is one of the most beautiful places in the whole world. And I saw this thing that drives me insane everywhere you go that's beautiful, which is people just staring at their phones and only looking at it through their screen to take pictures and selfies and just not looking around them. And normally when I see that, I want to go up to people and go, you're making a terrible mistake. You're not showing up at your own life. You're not being present at your own existence. This is terrible. I know you're afraid of missing out, but in fact, you're guaranteeing that you'll miss out if you don't look around you. But instead of that, I felt this really strong urge to go up to people and go, give me that phone. I want it. I just immediately start looking at social media because I realized for 15 years, I had been exposed throughout the day, all day, to the thin, insistent signals that we get from these sites, which are designed as rewards to keep us coming back. And when they were gone, this is a very pretentious way of putting it, but Simone de Beauvoir, the French philosopher, said that when she became an atheist, it was like the world had gone silent. And that's how it felt. It felt like the world had gone silent. No ordinary social interaction is going to flood you with hearts, right? It's just not how they work, unless it's a really intense social interaction, right? And I just remember feeling this tremendous sense of silence and like I had lost something really important. And that's when I realised, oh, it's not enough to just set aside these distractions. That creates a vacuum. You've got to then fill that vacuum with meaning. And that's what I then proceeded to do for the rest of the summer. I can talk about how, but what amazed me is once I got through that hump, those first 3 weeks, was how much my attention came back. I mean, I thought, I was nearly 40. I thought maybe my brain's just deteriorated, right? I've gotten older and maybe it doesn't work as well. My attention was as good as it had been when I was 17. I could sit and read for 8 hours a day. I could deeply focused on conversations. I was just so present. And I later realized when I interviewed loads of scientists that actually, as much as the tech, there were other changes I made that were as important for my attention and focus. I changed completely the way I eat. I'm normally a junk food addict. There is no junk food in Provincetown. There isn't even a Burger King. I felt sick when I realised that on the first day.
Except cupcakes.
Exactly, except for the cupcakes, which I essentially would have freebased if I could. I slept much more. I was much less stressed. There were all sorts of changes that I later learned to have a huge effect on your attention. But yeah, it was completely extraordinary. And weirdly, when I think about it now, I think about it in relation to something. So the light in Provincetown, the physical light, is really odd. And lots of painters go there. It's the purest light I've ever seen anywhere. And it's partly because, think about where Provincetown is. It's basically a sandbar jutting into the Atlantic Ocean. So what happens is, if you're facing the ocean in Provincetown, the sun is behind you. The sun sets behind you. But what happens is, as the sun sets, it glows forward onto the water, so that light reflects back at you. So you're basically getting the light of the sun twice. So everything has this incredibly crisp light.
Johann, that's very good for selfies.
I did not take one selfie. And,
What a waste.
I couldn't.
The point of being there.
I know. I curse myself every day. And in a funny way, there's this wonderful philosopher of attention called Dr. James Williams, who says that attention is like a form of light. And to me, that was exactly how it felt. It felt like I could see things so much more clearly. And it made me realize something about attention. I would just say to anyone listening, just think about anything you've ever achieved in your life that you're proud of. Whether it's learning to play the guitar, setting up a business, being a good parent, whatever that thing you're proud of is, that thing required a huge amount of attention and focus. And when attention and focus break down, as they are breaking down now, and the evidence is clear, your ability to achieve your goals breaks down, and your ability to solve your problems breaks down, and your ability to see the world around you clearly, to deploy your light, breaks down. And it felt like I got a moment when I could see what it would be like to get my light back. And I remember at the very end of my time in Provincetown, there's a place at the far end of Provincetown where you can look out over the whole place. And I remember going and sitting there and thinking, I'm never going to go back to that way of living. Why would I go back? This has been amazing. And I got my phone back the next day, and within a month, I never went back to being as bad as I was, but within about a month, I was 80% back to where I'd been. And I only understood why later when I went to meet this guy, Dr. James Williams, who had worked at the heart of Google, was horrified by what they were doing to our attention, quit, and became one of the leading philosophers of attention. And he said to me, the mistake you've made, Johann, by this trip, although there were great things about it, is it's like you thought the solution to air pollution was for you personally to wear a gas mask, right? Now, nothing wrong with wearing a gas mask. If I lived in Beijing, I'd wear a gas mask. But it's not the solution to air pollution. The real solution is we have to take on the factors that are doing this to us. Because the truth is, we're not going to be able to do what I did in Provincetown. I can't do it, and I did it, right? I can't do it in a sustained way. We have to tackle this at two different levels. I can talk more about that if you like, but I'm conscious I'm going on a bit here.
No, you're not. There's so much that I want to come back to in what you've just said. I want to start with, you talked about light, and in your book you talk about the different types of focus and comparing it to different types of light. Can you talk about that?
So this I also learned from James Williams. He's such a wise person. So he argues there's three types of attention. I would actually add a fourth one, which when I put it to him, he agreed with. The most obvious form of attention that most of us think about is your spotlight. So think about at the moment, I'm talking to you. Now I'm in a hotel room in Miami for my US book tour. So out the window to my left, there are people partying by a pool. I can see them. I can also see in the corner of the room, there's a television. I've left it switched off. I can hear the air conditioning. There's all sorts of things in this room. I'm sure in your room, everyone listening on your podcast, there'll be other things around them. And what I'm doing is I'm narrowing my light onto you. And Mia just asked me a question. What did she ask me? Okay, she asked me to describe the kinds of light. So that's the form of attention that most of us think about when we think about attention. It's your ability to attend to an immediate task. Listen to the podcast, go to the fridge and get a Diet Coke, reply to the email you just got. So that's one form of attention. It's obviously a really important one. James argues that the next level of attention is what he calls your starlight. So that's where, if you think about Spotlight as short-term actions, Starlight is a more medium or long-term action. So maybe you want to write a book, maybe you want to set up a business, maybe you want to, change something at your kid's school. That's a sort of more medium-term goal. It's called the Starlight because when you get lost in the desert and you don't know where you're headed, you look to the stars and you remember, oh yeah, that's where I wanted to head, right? The third level of focus that he talks about is what he calls your daylight. And your daylight is how you even know what your medium and longer term goals are in the first place. How do you know what it means to be a good parent? How do you know what kind of book you want to write? How do you know what kind of business you want to set up? How do you know what you want to change at your kid's school? It's called daylight because you can only see a room clearly when it's flooded with daylight. And what James argues, I think very persuasively, is that we're losing all of these forms of light are being disrupted. Your spotlight, your ability to do an immediate task is being constantly interrupted. Your ability to achieve medium-term goals is being hugely interrupted. And your ability to even know who you are so that you can achieve your medium and longer-term goals is being interrupted. And the fourth layer that I would argue is, I would call it our stadium lights. It's our ability to see each other, our ability to understand the people around us, our ability as a society to deal with big problems, whether it's COVID, global warming, the climate crisis, whatever it might be. I would argue that is being profoundly disrupted as well. And those are all forms of light. Those are all ways in which, he has a couple of metaphors for this, James, that are helpful. There were two that helped me. One is, he said, imagine you're trying to drive somewhere and someone throws a huge bucket of mud over your windshield. Doesn't matter what you've got to do when you get to your destination. The first thing you've got to do is clear the mud off your windshield, because you don't clear the mud off, you ain't going anywhere, right? And in a way, the attention crisis is a bit like that. If we don't deal with the attention crisis, we can't deal with any of our other problems. Because if you've just got a broken apparatus, if you think about the average office worker only focuses for 3 minutes. If your life is dissolved into 3-minute chunks, your ability to achieve pretty much anything is going to be really diminished. So yeah, I think those metaphors really help to clarify why this was so important to me.
And what attention is. Your book is called Stolen Focus, Not Lost Focus. And there's a big difference, isn't there? Because you lose something by accident, but if something's stolen, it's deliberately taken from you. And that's perhaps the greatest insight that you've had in your work. Can you talk to me about how our attention has in fact been deliberately stolen?
Yeah, there's lots of ways. So I'll focus on the obvious one that everyone thinks of. But one of the things that surprised me actually in the research is obviously the technology aspect is huge. But what surprised me is I don't actually think it's the biggest of the causes. It's really important. We've got to deal with it. I think there are even bigger causes than the aspects of our tech that are doing this. But the technology aspect is a huge element of this. And it's for a very simple reason. Social media, as it currently works, whether it's TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, the whole lot, is designed around one particular business model. Now, social media doesn't have to work this way. It's really important to understand this. This is not essential to the concept of social media. It just happened by accident that social media was developed with a particular business model. And that business model is really simple. Everyone listening, every time you pick up your phone and look at Facebook, Facebook starts to make money. And every time you put your phone down, that revenue stream disappears. So, and this is true of all the social media companies, their business model is built around getting you to look at your phone as much as possible. So all of their algorithms, all of their engineering power, all of this incredibly clever machinery in Silicon Valley is built around one thing. It's built around figuring out what will get you and your kids to pick up your phone most often and scroll for as long as possible. That's their business model. That's how they make money. Just like the head of KFC wants you to buy fried chicken, all the social media companies are built around maximally invading your attention. I spent a lot of time interviewing dissidents in Silicon Valley who'd worked at the heart of this machinery. They explained it to me. But even people at the heart of Facebook admit it publicly. Sean Parker, who was one of the biggest initial investors in Facebook, said, "We designed Facebook to maximally invade people's attention. We knew what we were doing and we did it anyway. God only knows what it's done to our children's brains." That's what they say, right? And so I was thinking a lot about this business model, and we can talk about the various ways in which Facebook is designed to hack and invade your attention.
You call it surveillance capitalism.
So that's a phrase that comes from an amazing woman named Professor Shoshana Zuboff, who coined that phrase and has done amazing analysis of this. And this business model is really important. But I would argue, for all of the 12 factors that I write about in Stolen Focus, there are two ways we've got to deal with this. I would call them defense and offense. So at an individual level, we've got to defend ourselves and our kids as much as we can from these invasions. I go through dozens of things that I do and that we can do. I'll give you just one example. You can't see this, Mia, from the angle you're at, but in the corner of my room over there, I've got something called a K-safe. It's a plastic safe. You take off the lid, you put your phone in, you put the lid on, you turn the dial at the top, and it locks your phone away for anything between 5 minutes and a whole day. I will not sit down with my partner and watch a film unless we both put our phones in the K-safe. I won't have dinner with my friends unless we all put our phones in the K-safe. When my godsons come round, I model the behaviour for them. And it's really difficult at first. But when the pleasures of focus and thinking deeply come back to you, it's so much greater than the pleasures of knowing whatever shit someone just said on Instagram, right?
Because you say that willpower isn't enough. Because we all do it in little ways. I was thinking this morning that, you know, you'll sit down at the table and people will put their phones face down. We do that to try and stop ourselves from being distracted by it. But I know that even the difference in my attention when I can see my phone, or that I know the phone's in the same room as me, is different to the quality of my attention if I know it's in another room or it's got no battery.
No, you're really right. And in terms of willpower, I had a real epiphany about this, because when I went to Provincetown, I thought the thing wrong with me, that was wrong with my attention, is that my willpower wasn't strong enough.
Yeah, same.
That's what and I had a real epiphany about this with an Australian, actually, a man who lives in Australia, a guy called Professor Roy Baumeister, who's an amazing social scientist, and he's the leading expert in the world on willpower. He wrote a book called Willpower. If anyone's heard of the marshmallow test, I'm sure lots of people have. He invented that. Yeah. So I go to interview him. It's very early in the research for the book. He's at the University of Queensland. And I said to him, you know, I'm thinking of writing a book about attention and whether it's getting worse. I'm just curious about your thoughts. And he said the exact words are in the book, but he said something like, oh, you know, it's kind of interesting you asked about that, because I found that my attention just isn't what it used to be. I just play video games on my phone all the time. I just can't really focus. And I'm sitting there opposite him and I'm like, wait, didn't you write a book called Willpower? Aren't you the leading expert in the world on willpower? It was like, you know, the moment at the end of The Invasion of the Body Snatchers where they realise everyone's been body snatched. I was like, wait, if this has happened to you, shit, has this happened to literally everyone, right?
Yeah.
And I remember leaving feeling really quite shaken, actually. But so there are lots of things that we can do as individuals. I'm passionately in favour of those things. Everyone should do them as much as they can, and I go through what they are in Stolen Focus. But I want to be completely honest with people. They will help, but they will only get you so far. Because at the moment, it's like someone is pouring itching powder over us all day, and then they're leaning over and going, do you know what, mate? You might want to learn how to meditate. Then you wouldn't scratch so much. To which the obvious response is, all right, I'll learn to meditate, but we need to stop you pouring fucking itching powder over me all day. And there are practical ways that we can do this. This is the second level for all of the 12 causes. And I stress again, tech isn't the biggest, but for all of the 12 causes that I talk about in the book, with one exception, I would argue there's these two levels at which we've got to deal with it. So there's the individual level, but then there's also got to be a collective level at which together we band together to stop these forces. And that can sound a bit fancy. So I'll give you an example from the history of Australia, a really heroic example of where people achieved this. So do you mind me asking how old you are, Mia?
50.
Right, so you'll remember this. I just remember it. You're slightly older than me. I'm 43. So you'll remember this. It used to be completely normal I remember my mum used to fill up her car with leaded petrol, right? And it used to be normal that people, this is a bit before my time and your time, but it used to be normal that people painted their homes with leaded paint.
Yeah.
And it was discovered by scientists that exposure to lead is really bad for your brain, and it is particularly bad for children's ability to focus and pay attention. And for years, the lead industry funded a bogus campaign to get people to blame themselves for lead poisoning. They said that housewives didn't dust often enough, and that was why their children had lead poisoning and their brains didn't work. In fact, you can dust your house infinitely and it won't stop lead poisoning, right? So by the time you got to the 1970s, it was really clear that lead was having a catastrophic effect. So what happened? In Australia, in Britain, in the United States, in many countries, ordinary women, they were mostly what were called at the time housewives, banded together and they just said, why are we allowing this? Why are we allowing this company to poison our children for profit? We need to stop this. And they campaigned for a change. And it's important to notice what they didn't campaign for. They didn't say, let's ban all petrol. And they didn't say, let's ban all paint. What they said is, let's ban the lead in the petrol and in the paint, because that's the element that was screwing up our focus and attention. And they succeeded. Leaded paint and leaded petrol are now banned, and they have been since the 1980s. And this analogy really helped me, because so often the way big tech wants us to debate this question is, are you pro-tech or are you anti-tech? And then you just get into despair because you're like, what does it even mean to be anti-tech? I'm not going to go and join the Amish, right? We're not going to give up our tech. So you sort of give it and go, oh, well, I may as well be pro-tech then. What alternative is there? That's not the question. The question is not, are you pro or anti-tech? The question is, what tech designed for what purposes, working in whose interests? At the moment, it's designed to hack our attention in the interests of advertisers. But there is a different way that this could work. So in Silicon Valley, I interviewed, of course, lots of the leading experts on these questions. And one of them, a guy called Asa Raskin, who designed a key part of how the internet works, his dad, Jeff Raskin, designed the Apple Macintosh for Steve Jobs. Asa said to me, look, if you want to deal with this aspect of the attention crisis, you've just got to do one thing. You've got to ban the current business model. Just like we banned lead in petrol, just say a business model that is based on surveilling you secretly in order to hack and invade your attention, to sell your attention to advertisers, is fundamentally inhuman, unjust, and we will not allow it. But I remember when lots of these dissidents said this to me, I remember saying to them, okay, but let's imagine we do that. What happens the next day when I open Facebook? Does it just say, oh, sorry, everyone, we've gone fishing? He said, of course not. What would happen is they would move to a different business model. And everyone listening has experience of these different business models. One model would be subscription. Maybe it's like Netflix. We'd pay a small amount, in return we get access. Or maybe it would be like the sewers. Everyone listening is close to a sewer. Before we had sewers, we had shit in the streets, we got cholera, it was a disaster. So we all paid to build the sewers and we all own the sewers together. Whatever city you're in, you own the sewers with everyone else who lives in that city. It might be like we own the sewage pipes together. We might also want to own the information pipes together because we're getting the equivalent of cholera for our attention. But the crucial thing is, when you move to a different business model, all the incentives change. At the moment, the incentives are, how do I hack Mia's attention as much as possible and as often as possible? How do I hack her kids' attention as much as possible and as often as possible? But when you move to a different business model, the incentives are different. At the moment, you're the product that they sell to advertisers. You're not the customer, you're the product, right? But when you move to a different business model, suddenly you're the customer. They have to say, what does Mia want? Oh, Mia wants to be able to pay attention. Okay. Let's design the app so it can help her pay attention. Oh, Mia wants to meet up with her friends who are nearby. Great, let's design the app to facilitate people meeting up offline. It's very easy to technologically design that. It's not happening at the moment because these companies don't have the incentive to do it. They're not going to change of their own accord any more than the lead industry was going to say one day, you know what, guys, we've just made enough money. It will only happen if, like happened with lead, enough of us band together and decide to defend our children's attention, our own attention, and make them do it.
But Johann, two problems with that. The first, and you say in your book, that's the point at which most people sort of putter to a stop and go, oh, well, that's too hard. And that's, you know, most of the books that have been written about attention sort of do stop at that point. The two problems with having to get political is, firstly, it takes, as you point out, collective focus and attention to make any social change, whether it's voting rights for women, civil rights for people of colour, or, you know, getting the lead taken out of paint. So isn't it a catch-22? We can't focus enough to change the fact that we can't focus. And the second thing I was going to say is that the legislators don't understand technology. I mean, all you have to do is watch those ridiculous hearings on Capitol Hill in the US with Zuckerberg or whoever it is running circles around those elderly senators who don't even understand where the internet is.
You're right. So it's possible that you're right on the first point. I hope you're not, and I don't think you are.
I hope I'm wrong.
Yeah. A lot of the time when I talk about this, and many of the other factors that we're going to have to take on, the way we eat is profoundly damaging our ability to focus and pay attention. There's a whole array of big forces. So I argue in the book that just like we needed, and of course still need, a feminist movement for women to reclaim their bodies and their lives, I argue we need an attention movement to reclaim our minds so that we can explain to people, this isn't your fault. This isn't your child's fault. This is happening to all of us, and we can take on these forces. But when people totally understandably say to me, and of course I thought to myself, God, these are such big forces. How are we ever going to do this? Maybe this will sound odd, but I think a lot about my grandmothers. I had two grandmothers. One was from Scotland, a working class Scottish woman who raised me because my mother was quite ill when I was a child. And I had a Swiss grandmother. And I loved both of them. They were completely incredible women. They both lived to be 91. And they, two of the deepest influences on me when I was a child. And I think a lot about the fact that my grandmothers were the age I am now in 1963. And I think about what their lives were like then. So both of them had left school when they were 13, even though the men in their family stayed on much longer because no one gave a shit about girls going to school. My grandmother loved to paint. My Swiss grandmother loved to paint and draw. They told her to shut up and get into the kitchen. So by the time they were the age I am now, neither of them were allowed to have a bank account in their own name because they were married women. It was legal for their husbands to rape them, as it was everywhere in the world legal for a man to rape his wife. In practice, it was legal for their husbands to beat the shit out of them because the police never intervened in domestic violence. My Swiss grandmother wasn't even allowed to vote. And I think about how daunting that must have seemed to them and how profoundly sexism and misogyny disfigured their lives. They never became the people that they should have become. They never got to cultivate their incredible talents because of that sexism and misogyny. And then I think about my niece's life, right? My niece is 17. She's called Erin. She's amazing. My niece loves to draw and paint. And when she loved to draw and paint, we didn't say, shut up and get into the kitchen. We started looking up art schools, right? I don't want to underestimate how much further we've got to go and how much more work there is to do.
Yeah.
But even the most crazed misogynist would not say that my niece shouldn't be allowed to have a bank account, shouldn't be allowed to vote, that it should be legal for a man to rape her. I mean...
But those changes happened at a time when we had more focus and more ability. Like, if you look at the internet and what passes as activism now, it's basically everyone will go, oh, it's really bad what the tech companies are doing, and then move on. Do you know what I mean? And there'll be something else by tomorrow morning. So how do you mobilise people in this environment of scattered attention?
There is a paradox here, but I absolutely believe enough people are frustrated about this, enough people are hungry for explanations, and enough people, particularly when we think about our children, enough people can see this as a disaster for our children. The last quarter of Stolen Focus is about what's happened to our children, how we can put it right. There's all sorts of changes that go way beyond tech as well.
I'm Mia Friedman, and you're listening to No Filter with Johann Hari. You're not a father, but you have a godson and nieces and nephews.
I've got lots of godsons.
You've got many godsons.
Gore Vidal said once, always a godfather, never a god. And that is basically how I feel. But I've got a lot of children in my life who I'm very, very close to. And I think particularly the desire to protect, when we look at our kids, one small study that's backed by a wider body of evidence in the United States found that a typical American college student focused on any one task for only 65 seconds, right? In fact, the median amount of time they focused was 19 seconds. This is horrifying, and we can see that it's making our kids less effective in the world, less able to achieve their goals, more anxious, less able to think deeply. So I do believe the desire to protect our children and the desire to reclaim our brains is strong enough that we can summon enough focus. But you're right that in a sense we're in a race, right? So a lot of these factors that are invading our attention, so we focused on one in particular rightly because it's one of the first ones people want to talk about, which is the components in our technology. Think just about that one alone. Paul Graham, one of the leading investors in Silicon Valley, said, the world is on course to become more addictive in the next 40 years than it was in the last 40. Think about how much more addictive TikTok is to a child than Facebook, right? The next iterations will be more invasive if we don't act. Think about the metaverse and these horrendous promised future that we have. So on the one hand, you've got these increasingly invasive technologies and lots of other factors that are increasing. And on the other hand, there's got to be all of us saying, no, we're not going to allow this. And it requires a shift in psychology. We need to stop blaming ourselves, right? Professor Joel Nigg, one of the leading experts on children's attention problems in the world, said to me that we need to ask if we're developing what he called an attentional pathogenic culture, a culture where it's extremely hard for all of us to focus. We've got to stop blaming ourselves. Professor Nigg drew a really interesting analogy for me with the obesity crisis. If you look at a picture of a beach anywhere in Australia or Britain in, say, 1970, at first it's really weird when you look at it, because everyone is what we would call slim or buff. Everyone. And you sort of look at it, it feels odd at first. It looks more like if you picture like Muscle Beach or something in Santa Monica in LA, like it looks like a place where only healthy people go. And then you look at the figures and you realize there was almost no obesity in the Western world in 1970. And since then, there's been an explosion in obesity for three very simple reasons. We changed our food supply radically. We eat completely differently, because the whole food supply system changed. We built cities that it's impossible to walk and bike around, and we became much more stressed, which made comfort eating much more appealing. But what happened is, instead of understanding those structural causes and dealing with them, putting all our energy into sorting out those problems, we can sort out our food supply system. There are countries that sorted it out. We can make cities that it's possible to bike around. The Netherlands is a real place. We can have policies that reduce stress. There's all sorts of ones I go through in the book. Instead of doing that, we all tortured ourselves. We all tried to starve ourselves in an environment where that's very difficult, where we're surrounded, and it didn't work, right? It failed. As we can see from the fact that me and everyone else has carried on gaining weight, right? And in a similar way, my worry is that at the moment we're responding to the attention crisis in the same way we responded to the obesity crisis, by basically just writing digital diet books. And I stress again, there are loads of things people can do as isolated individuals. I'm strongly in favour of them, and I do them myself, and I talk a lot about them in the book. But we've got to deal with the bigger picture. If we don't deal with the bigger picture, this will carry on happening to us and our kids.
But Johann, says Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg and the Google people and the Apple people, we've given you all of the tools. We've got screen time now. You can press buttons and have focus. We've given you all of these tools so that you can manage this. We're doing the right thing. We're such good global citizens, aren't we?
I mean, I'm not really interested in talking to them. I'm interested in pressuring them. There's no point in trying to persuade them. They've got a business model that is absolutely dependent on them doing what they're doing. But I would look at the specific aspects of the ways their apps work and explain to people the ways in which they deliberately invade our attention. So let's look at a very simple one. I went to interview one of the leading neuroscientists in the world, a man named Professor Earl Miller, who's at MIT. And he said to me, there's one thing you've got to understand about the human brain more than anything else. You can only consciously think about one or two things at a time. That's it. This is a fundamental limitation of the human brain. Human brain hasn't changed significantly in 40,000 years. It's not going to change on any timescale any of us are going to see. You can only think about one thing at a time. But we've fallen for a mass delusion as a result of the invasion of these apps, partly. These apps are constantly interrupting us. And to deal with those interruptions, we've created a story. The average American teenager now believes they can follow 7 forms of media at the same time. And these apps are designed to interrupt you, to get you to pick them up more. So we rationalize that behavior by saying, oh, I can multitask, I can do lots of things at the same time. But when scientists get people into labs and get them to think they're doing lots of things at the same time, they monitor them. And whenever they do that, they discover something really important called the switch cost effect. Switch cost effect is really simple. When you try and do lots of things at the same time, it turns out you can't. What you do is you juggle very quickly between them. You go, what did that text message say? What was that thing on Facebook? Wait, what did Mia just ask me? Wait, what was on Facebook? Oh yeah, and now I've got a message on WhatsApp. Wait, what did Mia say? You're juggling very rapidly. And it turns out that comes with an enormous cost. You will do everything you're trying to do less competently. You'll make more mistakes. You'll remember less of what you do. You'll be much less creative. And when you hear about that, when I first heard about it and I was looking at the science, I thought, yeah, I get it, but that's a small effect, right? Turns out it's huge. Just receiving 8 text messages in an hour reduces your mental performance by 30%. And we're all living at that level of diminishment. But there was one study that really drove it home for me. It's a very small study, but it's backed by a wider body of evidence. Hewlett-Packard, the printer company, called in a scientist and got him to do a little study. He split their workers into 2 groups. And the first group was told, just do whatever you've got to do, your task for the day, and you're not going to be interrupted. And the second group was told, do whatever your task is, but you're going to have to answer a fairly heavy load of email and phone calls. So pretty much how all of us live. And at the end of it, they tested the IQ of all of the workers. The workers who had not been interrupted scored, on average, 10 IQ points higher than the workers who had been. To give you a sense of how big that effect is, Mia, if you and me got stoned together now, if we just smoked a fat spliff, our IQs would go down in the short term by 5 IQ points. So at least in the short term, the effect is twice as big for being distracted as it is for getting stoned. You would be better off sitting at your desk, smoking a spliff and doing one thing at a time than you would sitting at your desk, not smoking any weed and being distracted all the time. To be clear, you'd be better off doing neither, obviously. But you can see how big an effect. This is why Professor Miller said to me, we are living in a perfect storm of cognitive degradation as a result of being constantly interrupted. Now, to relate that to your question, of course, Mark Zuckerberg would say, well, I gave you the button. Just put on Do Not Disturb.
Correct.
The whole machinery is designed to interrupt you, to distract you. And what they want to do is transfer the responsibility onto you to say, well, it's your fault. But the truth is, you can't invade us all the time, have a business model built around invading us, admit that that's how you designed it, and then say, well, it's your problem if you don't restrain yourself. That's not a credible argument.
You say there are 3 things the tech companies could do if they wanted to tomorrow to help us regain some of our lost focus. What are they?
Well, there's loads of things they could do, loads of ways in which it could be redesigned. I mean, some of them are really simple. When you get told that someone's tagged you in a photo, you think it'll take a few seconds to click on that. On average, it takes 12 minutes before you get back to what you were doing before. It could, every time they tell you that you've been tagged, just say, you think this will only take a few seconds, it'll actually take 12 minutes. Very simple, very easy to do. It could batch your notifications. So instead of you getting a drip feed of notifications throughout the day, a kind of social cocaine, it could just send you a notification once a day at a time you choose. So you're not being constantly interrupted. There's a huge array of things that they could do. Now, they're not going to do that unless we make them change their business model. For as long as they make more money, the more you're interrupted, they'll carry on interrupting you. It's really simple.
The problem, though, is at the root of it is our addiction, because I like being interrupted. I don't know why I like it, but there's something that feels good about, oh, I've got a new message. Oh, I'll go and see what's on my email. Oh, I'll go and have a look at Slack. Oh, I'll go and have a look at Instagram. What's at the root cause of our addiction? Because we're really vulnerable to it, aren't we?
I think there's lots of things going on. And I think these are very deep causes. I think there's a degree to which, of course, human beings there's always going to be a conflict, even in any society, even one that was designed perfectly. There would always be some conflict between distraction and focus. I think the society we've created loads us towards the distractions for a lot of kind of key reasons. I'll give you an example of a big change that's happened that's made us much more vulnerable to that kind of distraction. We sleep on average 20% less than people did a century ago. In fact, children sleep 85 minutes less than they did a century ago. And this has a profound effect on attention. Only 15% of us wake up feeling refreshed. So I interviewed loads of the leading experts on sleep in the whole world. And it was really sobering. I remember interviewing this amazing man called Dr. Charles Czeisler, who's at Harvard Medical School. So he's advised everyone from the US Secret Service to the Boston Red Sox on sleep. And he explained to me that sleep is essential for your ability to focus and pay attention. That when you're sleeping, your brain is repairing. It's cleaning out the metabolic waste that builds up during the day, and it's carrying it down to your liver and it's getting it out of your body. All sorts of essential physical and mental processes happen when you're sleeping. And when you dramatically cut back sleep, as we have, it has a catastrophic effect on attention. In fact, he discovered that if you stay awake for 19 hours, which doesn't feel like very much, your attention degenerates as much as if you had got legally drunk. And there was one study he did that really chilled me. He was the first person in sleep research to put together two technologies. There's a technology that can scan your eyes to see what you're looking at, and at the same time, there's a technology that we all know about that scans your brain. It can scan your brain to see what's happening there. When he put tired people into these machines, what he discovered is you can be visibly awake, you can be looking around you, you can be talking as surely as we're talking now, yet whole parts of your brain can have gone to sleep. We sometimes say, I'm half asleep. That's not a metaphor. A lot of us are half asleep a lot of the time. So this is a key factor. You can see how that interacts with the way I started to think about it is if you think about these technologies as a virus, right? They've got their own power. They would have been powerful at any time. But they came along at a moment when our immune system was hugely down. Think about when you're tired, how much more tempting it is to just mindlessly scroll through TikTok. The way we eat was another factor that's hugely depleted our immune system. So our ability to resist these factors invading our attention. And this is something I'd never even thought about before I started researching the book. I interviewed, there's this really interesting movement called nutritional psychiatry, who are looking at how what we eat affects our ability to mentally perform, our mental health, and so on. And a lot of these nutritional psychiatrists and other people explained to me that the way we eat is profoundly harming our attention in three ways. The first way was explained to me by one of Britain's best-known nutritionists, Dale Pinnock. So imagine that you start with a typical British, and I'm pretty sure Australian, breakfast. You have either sugary cereal or white bread, the kind of stuff I grew up having for breakfast. What that does is it releases a huge amount of energy into your brain really quickly. It releases a lot of glucose, and it feels great. You feel like you've finally woken up, right? You're like, oh, you're ready for the day. But what happens is an hour or two later, you're at your desk or your kid's at their desk, and you experience a brutal energy slump. And then you experience brain fog, where it's hard to think, it's hard to focus until you have another sugary, carby treat. The way we eat means that we live on a roller coaster of energy spikes and energy crashes, which leaves us with big patches of brain fog throughout the day. The way Dale Pinnock put it to me is it's like we're putting rocket fuel into a Mini. It goes really fast for a bit and then just crashes out. And then we put in more rocket fuel and more rocket fuel. But if you eat a diet, as most humans have throughout history, that releases energy steadily throughout the day, you won't experience brain fog like that. The second way is that our diet lacks a lot of the nutrients that are necessary for your brain to develop, things like omega-3s. And it turns out supplements just don't match that. The third way is even more chilling. It's not just that our diets lack the stuff we need. Our diets also contain things that act on our brains like drugs. There was a study in Britain, in Southampton in 2007, where they got 297 kids and they split them into two groups. And the first group was just given water, and the second group was given water laced with the kind of synthetic dyes that are contained in all sorts of food that you buy at the supermarket, candies, that kind of thing. And the kids who drank the synthetic dyes were significantly more likely to become hyperactive, manic, to run around, to have attention problems. So the way we eat, which again, we sort of choose it, but is largely a product of the complete transformation that's been brought by the food industry, that is also having a big effect. And you can see how these things all interact with each other. The food gives us brain fog. You've got brain fog, so you're more likely to scroll mindlessly through TikTok. You're more likely to scroll through TikTok, so you're seeing glowing light before you go to sleep, so you're less likely to get sleep. You can see how these things interact, but one of the good things about that is when you start to break that spiral, you can actually see positive effects really quickly, and that's what I've found.
COVID. So you started, discuss. No, you started your book, thank God, before COVID. So you could actually go to all the cities that began with M. But then just before you went to Moscow, you noticed some people at Heathrow wearing masks. And when you came back, you started feeling unwell. Your book in many ways is your whole experience of looking at attention is buffered by these two different intense periods, the time you spent in Provincetown having your digital detox, and then the months you spent isolated, and many of us all over the world have spent isolated due to COVID. Given that stress and this vigilance that we all have just generally, even before COVID, can lead to a loss of attention. What effect has COVID had on our attention collectively? Because you talk about brain fog. A lot of people are talking about that, whether they've had COVID or even if they haven't had COVID.
Yeah, I felt weirdly well prepared for understanding. I remember at the start of COVID, my friends saying to me, those who were lucky enough to not be doing the heroic work of being health workers or the other essential workers, saying to me, I'm going to be shut inside a lot. I'm going to finally read Tolstoy. I'm going to learn French on Duolingo.
Yes.
And no fucker read Tolstoy and no one learned French.
No.
In fact, people Googling, how do I get my brain to work, increased by 300%.
Yes.
And the reason I think I was well prepared to understand why, because I'd done a lot of research before this on the effect that stress has on attention. And there's a particular woman, an extraordinarily heroic woman called Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, who had explained something to me. I stressed that she was not talking about COVID, but I think it applies to COVID. She's now the Surgeon General of California, the leading medical official in the state. And Nadine said to me one day when we were sitting in San Francisco, imagine one day you were attacked by a bear out of the blue and you survived. In the weeks and months that followed, something completely involuntary would happen to your attention. You would find it harder to focus on deep tasks like spending a lot of time with your kids deeply, reading a book, whatever it might be, because a big part of your brain would flip towards trying to detect risks and dangers all around you. Because something came out of the blue, so your brain is just, okay, what else is going to come out of the blue? Okay, now imagine that you were attacked by a bear again. You'd have to be pretty unlucky, but imagine it happens. You would likely then flip into a state called hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is where you can't focus on the things in front of you, because you're just scanning for risk and danger. And there's a wonderful doctor in Australia, Dr. John Giardini, who's in Adelaide. He works with traumatized children. He said to me, look, attention, deep focus are really good strategies when you're safe. Sit down and read a book, you'll grow. But deep focus is a very stupid strategy if you're in danger. You'd be a fool to sit at Gallipoli reading a novel. You're going to be killed, right?
Right.
So deep attention evolved to be something we can provide when we feel safe. And this helps us to understand this much wider body of evidence. As we've become more stressed, we've found it harder to pay attention. I mean, more normal forms of stress. I think it also helps to explain about COVID. Actually, particularly in this third wave, it's like the bear came back a third time.
Yes.
Right? Does that ring true to you, Mia?
Yeah, 100%. Everyone's just so, like, you just think you're getting back, and then it's like again and again. And it's literally everything is a threat. Walking outside, seeing family, having a conversation with someone, buying your groceries. It's not like I just have to be careful when I walk in the woods in case there's a bear. It's like, when I see my mother, I have to be careful because we could kill each other. Like, how do you even get your head around that?
Do it's funny? I remember I was contacted during COVID by someone I hadn't seen since I was 17. And she said, Johann, I just want to check you're okay. And I said, I'm okay. Well, it's nice, but what made you think of me? And she said, I don't know if you remember this, but we watched some movie about the end of the world when we were 17. And we all talked about the point in the collapse of civilization where we would all kill ourselves. And she said, you said it's when they close all the branches of KFC and when they stop filming Neighbours. And she said, and I realised that has actually happened. So I just wanted to check you were all right. And I was like, oh my God, my 17-year-old vision of the apocalypse actually took place. So that stress, it can help us to understand how other strategies for reducing stress boost attention. And there's an example that I learned about just across the Tasman in New Zealand that really helped me to think about this, where I went to, it's a really fascinating story and something, again, a change we can fight for at a collective level. So there's a guy called Andrew Barnes. He worked in the City of London. He was a banker. He worked as a stock trader in the 1980s. If you picture all those images from the 80s of like people shouting across the stockroom floor,
buy,
sell,
sell.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He was that guy, right? And the way Andrew put it, this is the language he would have used back then. He wouldn't use it now. It's not language I would use. But in that world, you were a wuss if you got to work later than 7:30 a.m. and you were a pussy if you left before 7:30 p.m. So half the year, he just never saw the sun because he would leave in the dark and get home in the dark. He didn't have a proper relationship with his kids. And Andrew was smart enough to just be like, I don't want to live like this. He got out. He came to Australia and New Zealand and became hugely successful. And he runs a company called Perpetual Guardian that administer wills and trusts. And one day in 2018, Andrew was on a plane and he read an article that said that the average worker only actually focuses on their tasks at work 3 hours a day. So they're sitting there, but they're distracted. They're, looking at social media. They're trying to sort out the rest of their life. And he's like, well, this is a nightmare for everyone. He remembered how unhappy he was when he overworked. He's like, this isn't good for them. This isn't good for us. It's not good for the boss and it's not good for the worker. And he suddenly had this epiphany. He thought, well, what if all my workers moved to a 4-day week, but I paid them the same as I do for 5 days? If that made them just 45 minutes more productive a day, it would pay for itself, right? They'd be as productive. So he did a conference call for his entire company and he said, hey, everyone, I'm giving you an extra day off a week and I'm going to pay you the same. His head of HR literally fell over. So I spent a lot of time with this company. I interviewed everyone in their offices in Rotorua, a lovely but weird town in New Zealand, which smells weirdly of farts, although very nice. And it was so interesting, this was studied by the University of Auckland Business School. They were more effective in 4 days than they had been in 5. And I was trying to figure out, it feels too good to be true, but this has been found in all the other 4-day week experiments across the world from Sweden to Japan. So why would that be, right? Because they would describe how they would sleep more, they just chilled out more, they had space for mind wandering, for just thinking of themselves, looking after their kids. And then I interviewed this guy called Professor Jeffrey Pfeffer, who's a professor of organisational behaviour at Stanford. And he said to me, look, I was like saying, I don't really understand it. And he said, it's not difficult to understand. Ask any sports fan, do you want your team to walk onto the pitch exhausted, worn out, having done a 10-hour day the day before? Of course, no sports fan wants that. You want them to walk onto the pitch well rested, up for the game. And so a move to a 4-day week, that's another stress. We're talking a lot about the very big things, and I think that's right. There are lots of much smaller things that I advocate that we can do in the book as well at a more individual level. But we've got to identify, because at the moment people just blame themselves, right? They're exhausted, they're overworked, they're invaded by this technology, they're eating a diet that destroys their attention, they're exposed to air pollution that damages their brains.
They're perimenopausal.
But they just individualize the problem. It's all on me. And there's a relief in knowing it's not that there's something wrong with you, and it's not that there's something wrong with your children, and we don't have to live like this. We don't have to tolerate this being done to us. There are different ways this can work. We're all the beneficiaries of big changes. Think about how your grandmothers were treated. Compare it to how you're treated. It's still not good enough, but it's a lot better. We can make these things better. There was a moment, Dr. James Williams, the guy I mentioned earlier, he said to me once, the axe existed for 1.4 million years before anyone thought to put a handle on it. The entire internet has existed for less than 10,000 days. These are recent changes.
Yeah.
We can deal with them. So there's been all sorts of these really big changes for all of the 12 factors that I write about in Stolen Focus. These are, with a couple of exceptions, they're very, very recent changes, right? In the long arc of human history, they're very recent. We don't have to be like this. It's not normal that the average office worker can only focus for 3 minutes. It's bonkers. This is a crazy way to live. What we're depriving ourselves of is depth. You don't want to get to the end of your life and think of a hailstorm of 3-minute task switching. That's not a good life. That's not how any of us want to live. We can resist this.
Has that blown your head off a little bit? Well, there's actually even a bit more. There were so many of these massive aha moments that came out of my conversation with Johann. There were so many revelations that made me think, oh, thank God it's not just me. We have released a bonus episode for paid Mamamia subscribers. They're the ones who get unlimited access to all the best content for women. And we're going to be making a few of these bonus no filter episodes that will only be available to Mamamia subscribers. We're going to be releasing them pretty regularly this year, so you should definitely subscribe. I'll tell you how to do that in a second. But in this bonus episode, I asked Johann about what had actually happened with his godson. What was the experience that was so shocking that it made him sort of freak out and devote years of his life to writing this book and exploring this area. And we also talk about the things that as parents or anyone with a kid in their life that you can do to help divert kids from screens without banning them entirely, because we all know that's just not realistic. And if you want to listen, follow the link at the top of the episode description or head to mamamia.com.au /M+. That's MPLUS. And we've also put a link to Johann's book, Stolen Focus, in our show notes. And if all of that is too hard for you to concentrate on, go to my Instagram, click the link in my bio to subscribe to M+. No Filter is produced by GM Moylan and the executive producer is Eliza Ratliff. I'm Mia Friedman and I'll see you soon.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of the land we have recorded this podcast on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures.